I love the store. I have like a finish all the time. I know the store. Are you gonna return the stuff? Yeah. The thing I like about it is that it's just sort of higher quality. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then
Henry, can you start me a sign-in sheet, please? Thank you. Okay, guys. I want to take a look at a little work from the week. Stuff that actually got turned in. Okay, I'm going to start with Taylor's Liquify. So a lot of you guys, pretty much a lot of people got kind of the gist of sort of how to do part of this. The distortion that happens in Liquify, in some cases it's really good. And if you take a look at what Taylor did to the girl's body, it actually ended up being pretty good. I thought I would have drawn her stomach in a little bit more. I would have lifted her boobs and her shoulders up a little bit as well. But the work that was done on the legs and the hips and the arms and all that kind of stuff were all done really, really well. The problem is that you run into the face, and it's just a consequence of it. I have spent hours working on this file to try to use Liquify to fix the face, which it is indeed possible to do. It just takes forever to do it. So I don't do it. Instead, what I do, and a lot of people, actually, about half of you guys, I think, picked up on this. So I don't know if there's a bunch of videos of mine that are out there that show this, or if you just talk to people from previous classes, or just figured it out on your own. Either way, it doesn't really matter. It was the ultimate fix in this. So to do the final fix in this, which is what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to hit the L key to get the lasso tool. I'm going to select my base layer, the one that's not been changed at all. I'm going to select this big broad area of it, Command J to jump it to its own layer, bring it all the way up to the top. This is now her head up on the top. And you can see here, if I hit the V key, I can actually move it around, that it's basically the corrected sort of version of her, it's the de-distorted version of her face. So I'm going to bring it up, I'm going to get it close to here, I'm going to drop the opacity of this, hit Command T to do a transform, and then I'm going to rotate it to just try to get her eyes to line up with the liquefied eyes. So this is a two-step process. The liquefying that Taylor did was actually correct because it resets her neck and it resets her shoulders. So what I'm looking for is just to fix the face. I don't want to change anything else. So it's not like you can just do a copy and a rotate like what I'm doing right now, because you'll see, I'm going to take the opacity all the way back up again, that her shoulders are set way too far off. I mean, it's somehow that's not going to work either. So the liquefy part that she did was correct, but again, I'm just trying to fix specifically the eyes and the mouth and the nose. So with this rotated and somewhat in register, I'm going to hold down the Option key and click to add a black layer mask to this. I'm going to zoom way into this. Hit the B key to get a brush. Are you guys laughing at this? Oh, Taylor's was actually... yours was really pretty good. There are some people that it's like, oh my, that person, that's alien person. Okay, so at any rate, hit the B key to get a brush, hit the D key to default my foreground and background colors to black and white. Make sure that my blending mode is normal. I'm going to make sure that this is a soft brush, 100% opacity, 100% flow. Make the brush slightly smaller. Make sure I am working on my layer mask. And then simply come in and fix the eyes and probably the nose and the mouth. And you could leave it at that. I think it makes her face still seem a little bit broad here. This is what the change looks like. When you do this, you should actually hold down, and I want you guys to get in the habit of doing this always, no matter what it is we're really doing here. To get in the habit of holding down the Option key and clicking on your mask and simply looking at the mask. Because if you had, for instance, this going on in your mask, you would know that there is a problem. This would be contamination in your mask. So it's just a way to check it out to make sure that that it's doing what you think it's actually doing here. So in my case, I could continue this somewhat. I have a little bit of a double layer I can see right here in her hair. So again, I would probably take her her eyebrows up like that. If I feel like, hang on, that was the wrong move. Sorry. More like this. If I feel like her face is still a little bit broad, I can try to actually use the new face that I've got, or actually the face that I'm replacing it with. And in this case, it works pretty well, but you run into problems like this. You can see there's a ghosting of the earring right here. So I have to take care of that guy. So again, this is now what I've ultimately done as far as that part goes. If you feel like the head is still distorted, like I think this head is actually pushing out a little bit too far here on the top, you can continue this whole process. It was a little distorted out on the top. You'll see as I'm starting to come back in here, I'm starting to run into a little bit of trouble because I'm going back to the original hair. So I'm going to hit the X key and probably take that guy out. And this seems like a better fix to me like this. If you feel like the head is still a little bit too wide, you want to narrow it down just a little bit more. I'm just double clicking to jump out of this. You guys are getting to the point now where you start making multiple layers of this stuff. So I'm working off of Taylor's original file. She started out with a smart object. She's gone through a whole series of liquefies on a smart object, all very good work. I've actually changed this now to actually take the distortion out of her face again. With this as my topmost layer, I'm going to hold down the Command, Option, Shift, and hit the letter E to create a merge stamp version of everybody. Up to the layer menu, down to Convert to Smart Object, and immediately into Liquify. So this process can go on and on and on. It doesn't have to be all in one shot. It can actually go, you can continue to do more steps than just one. So I'm going to start out a little bit larger. Those guys are somewhat right, whatever. And then I can actually start to push her face in just a little bit to reshape that if I want to. But now I'm not reshaping the distorted face. So anyway, that's how I would go about doing the final fix. And so then if we jump back out, go down to the very bottom, hold down the Option key and click on the eyeball at the bottom, it loses all the layers and you can see actually what's going on here. So again, there was other things that I would have done to that, but I just wanted to show everybody how to fix that. I got together with Lindsay during the week, and I'm going to show you what hers ended up looking like. Just a couple of tricks that I thought you guys should consider in this as well. Again, I've done this one a whole lot. Is actually the addition of a small little bit of white space on the side of her body right here. Actually does wonders as far as actually making her stomach appear a little bit thinner and a little bit more. So you guys should just consider doing things like that as well. Just to bring that up. One more liquefy really quick right here. Yeah, Anna Marie's. This one actually, again, I thought in parts were done reasonably well as far as that part goes. But look what happens to these hands. Giant hands. So, and I know it's a consequence of trying to actually pucker in the stomach. So that part was actually correct. But I think you needed to freeze the hands before, or freeze the hands and freeze the arms before you actually went down that road. Anyway, yeah. Okay, I need everybody. I'm not going to bother to go through. Well, actually, that's not true. I've got a couple of questions about, we're going to do that knockout on green screen ourselves here in class today. So, but I want to look at a couple of them first because I had a question about a couple of them. Look at Ari's first. Well, it was really well done. But Ari, what was the second alpha channel down here about? It was just the hair. Do you remember why you did that?
I think it was what?
They look really similar to, it didn't look like there was a big change in here. But the hair, this hair was the most difficult part of this whole knockout process. But when I look at the difference in that and this, it didn't seem like they were, you know, because sometimes like when we were doing, when we were knocking out Sunny, we would do another method to get this and then try to put the two together. I didn't know if that's what you were doing there or not.
It was something like that.
Okay, all right, but you can't remember what it was. Either that or you're just lying to us. You don't want any of us to know the real secret to doing this really well. And yeah, gee, thanks.
That I used for some selection and then forgot to delete.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, I'm going to show you one more, and then we're actually going to do this all together in class. So if you are missing this homework, save it and turn it in. Okay, but I want to look at Kim's really quick just to show you guys, because this goes back to another issue that I was talking about. Sorry, that was not Kim's, was it? About this whole idea of inspecting your masks by themselves. In Kim's case, this gets pretty torn up here at the top, whatever. I'm going to show you guys how to fix that part. But you look at the rest and you're thinking, well, oh, maybe not so bad, whatever, but you spot this. Anyway, again, if you hold down the Option key and click on your mask, you spot the problems right away. You can see there's contamination in here. There's some more in the background. There's some in the shoes down here. It's just something to actually look at. You can also see that there's it looks like there's an area in here where she was probably using overlay or something and just missed this area right in here. So it's just a thing to inspect your masks. It's not enough to inspect them done like this. You should also invert these masks. You look at what you just picked up contamination-wise by inverting it. I had no idea that I had a problem here in this sleeve. I had no idea I had a problem in all these. So again, I'm going to invert it again. You don't see that contamination necessarily, but when you invert it, you sure do. So it's just a way to examine your masks to make sure that everything is the way you ultimately want it to be. So with that being said, I want you to open up a fresh version of this, if you will. Or you can open up the version that you've worked on, and we'll just start from the beginning. So that was in week 9. Okay, so we're starting out in week 9. The very first thing we're going to do is do you guys still have that 0 selective color action on these computers? If you don't have it, make it really, or just go ahead and essentially do it really fast. So again, hue saturation layer first is a selective 0 color on top. Make sure that it is set to absolute. Your screen should look pretty black like that, although mine really doesn't look black. But it is. All right, so at any rate, if it's not in your 0 selective color, make sure that the absolute radio button at the bottom is selected, not the relative one. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is in the 0 selective color, we are actually going to go to the greens. Grab the black slide at the bottom and drag it all the way to the left-hand side. And then I'm going to zoom into the hair because the hair is actually the most difficult one, and this was the one that people sort of tore apart a little too quickly. And and this is why. So if you select on the hue saturation layer that's underneath the selective color and click on the targeting adjustment tool, you can click and it will actually pick up the green color. And if you start to drag to the right, it will actually it's making that green more saturated, which in effect then lightens up the background, because we've said we want pure green to be white by using the selective color. So as we continue to do that, however, if you zoom into this hair pretty closely, as you're clicking and dragging to the right, you will see that you reach a point where the hair starts to shatter. It starts to tear apart pretty badly. So, and again, if you go all the way up to 100%, which is what a lot of you guys did, it just absolutely annihilates all the hair, especially in this part down here, and this part over in this section as well. This part's all pretty torn up. This part's all pretty torn up. So the thing is that your saturation move here is too strong. And the reason I actually do this exercise is to show you that it isn't always a question of getting the green to completely saturate. What's happening is that this girl actually has green spill in her hair, which should actually be there. But by doing this saturation move as hard as we are, we're actually forcing the green spill in her hair to be saturated to the point that it actually gets knocked out, which is not what we want. So instead of going that hard on this, I'm going to still working on the hue saturation layer, still with the targeting adjustment tool. I'm going to click and I'm going to drag towards the left to lower my saturation down. And the entire time I'm looking at what's happening with this girl's hair. In terms of how to do this. Now, I'm just doing small little steps to push this up and to push this down. And the thing is that as I'm continuing to go, I'm primarily looking at this area on the left side over here. As I'm continuing to push that up, I feel like at 66%, that's actually still too strong. I'm tearing it apart too much. So I'm backing this thing off down again, dropping it down a little bit. I've got a saturation of 50%, 53% roughly. That is as far as I'm going to actually push this guy. Now, in the past, and I can take a look around, you can see that there's contamination down here in the bottom. I know I'm going to have to deal with some of these other issues, but I'm fine with that because I've still got a huge amount of contamination. The background's not white yet, so I realize that. But you remember in the past, I've said to you guys, it doesn't matter now, because what we're going to basically do is we're going to take one of these channels, either the red, green, or blue channel, and we're going to use the red, green, or blue. We're just going to make a copy of that because it is the black and white version of this, and they're all the same. However, they're not all the same because this saturation move is not all the way up at 100%. These channels are not identical. If this thing was all the way up at 100%, each of the red, green, and blue channels would be identical. But to see that, right now, if you click on the top RGB channel, you can sort of see, if we click on just the red channel and then back up to RGB, you can see that there is indeed a shift between these two. And in my opinion, the red starts tearing the hair apart again. It's not as good as the full RGB guy. If I look at the green channel, the very same thing is happening. It's not as complete as the full RGB channel. And then finally the blue, if I click on the blue down here and then back up to the RGB guy, again, the RGB channels themselves are not, in my opinion, as good as the RGB composite. So I want to use the RGB composite. To do that, you simply hold down the Command key and click on the RGB guy, and it loads that RGB luminosity as a selection. Up to the Select menu, down to Save Selection, and call it Knockout. And say, okay, Command D to deselect, and you will then be able to scroll down to the very bottom of your channels palette, and it's sitting right down here as Knockout. Now, in order for us to work on that, you cannot be on the hue saturation layer or the selective color. You need to select the background layer for us to do any sort of pixel work on this channel over here, which is what I'm actually working on. So click to make sure that the Knockout channel is the active one. For that matter, you could throw away the hue and saturation layer both. They've both done their jobs. I don't need those guys anymore. Again, I'm simply clicking on my Knockout channel to actually work with it. So for it, I am going to then put down 2 color sampler points. So I'm over here to the color sampler, to the thing that looks like the little eyedropper. Click on that and come down to the color sampler tool. And I'm going to drop 1 sample out here in the background. And then again, I noticed contamination here. I noticed contamination right around the beads. And I noticed a little bit on the arm over here. I'm going to go ahead and drive the beads to black as well. So I'm just going to pick something over here in the bead area. It's not like I couldn't run a brush on this. I could. As a matter of fact, I think I'm going to do that because that's pushing it too extreme. I'm going to go after this contamination right here. It's hard to see on this screen up here, but I am seeing a little bit of contamination right on her arm. So I'm going to set a sampler point right there. So that gives me sample points 2 and 3. I've got another 1 sample point somewhere out on this image. I have no idea where it is. But I know that I just set those 2 points. This one's got the number 3 on it, so I know that's what it is. So anyway, I'm going to then use my eyedropper tools in the info palette to click and change them to RGB and do the same for point number 3. And then Command L to bring up the levels dialog box. I'm also going to hold down the space bar to get the hand and go back up to the hair. I want to make sure that this levels move is not going to tear this hair apart again. Again, this hair is the most difficult thing for us to get right. Like all these little feathery things over here, I want to make sure I hang on to at least some of those. So I'm going to grab the white point slider up here and start to drag it back. I'm watching my info palette the entire time. And once I get to 450, I'm going to let go. And I'm actually going to then go to my arrow keys and start to go until I get to just 255. And then you'll notice that actually increased my black point value from 8 up to 10. So I'm going to grab my black slider and drag him. And again, get that as close as I can. I'm going to go straight to the arrow keys because it looks like it's jumping. The minute I touch it, it actually jumps out. So again, make sure that I go from 8 to 5 to 0 all in one hit. So then I'm going to actually look around this guy, and I'm going to use my preview checkbox and turn it on and off and say to myself, am I keeping enough of this fine little finesse of hair? Am I keeping enough of this in my layer mask to feel good about this? And actually, I feel like I am. I've got a little bit of contamination that's happening over here on this side of her head, but I can fix that with an overlay brush. Before I say yes to any of this, I'm going to take a look around the rest of her body. And I typically will drop my hand out here on the other side over here to see if I'm still staying in this 250 range. You'll notice I'm getting a reading over here that's not in that 250 range. It's actually in I'm getting like a 251, 249. I'm going to zoom back out a little bit and take a look around the rest of my image. I'm going to come into this area right down here, and you can see, just looking at the readout up in the top, that I'm getting like a 245 down here, whatever. I'm actually not getting the correct, I'm not getting a white enough background. So if you want to change where your number is, it's this number 2 up here. If you want to change where this guy is, or if I want to change my number 1 right here, I can do that. You hold down the Shift key, and it will give you the pointer that lets you reposition your color readouts. So I've repositioned my number 1 point right here. I'm going to go back to the RGB guy here, and I can see that this is reading as a 245 right now, which means I haven't hit this white point hard enough. So I'm going to continue hitting that white point down until I get that to 255. And then again, I'm going to zoom back in up to the hair to make sure that that move didn't go too far. So again, using this on and off. I feel like that's too aggressive a move. I'm going to back that off again until that reads 245. I'm going to have to clean that up with an overlay brush. So I'm going back to where I was in the initial one, and I feel better about that. So again, it's this constant back and forth of like looking at your mask, looking at the parts that are important. I'm going to check out the area down here on the fur That part all seems reasonably good. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. If you want the exact same levels that I had, you would have had to put in all the same ones that I did. But I've got a white point setting of 122 and a black point of 4. I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. They came up doing what? Oh, everybody come look at this really quick, because this is actually a really good point to see, because this will happen all the time. So what's happening here is that you've actually, when she made the selection to actually create this knockout, right? She command clicked, loaded that thing as a selection. It created this as the knockout, and then she's running levels on this. The problem is she's running levels on still the selected part. So hit cancel out of here. You get this just narrow band in the histogram. Command D to deselect, and then hit Command L to bring levels up again, and you've got your whole histogram. No, it's a good thing that happened, because it happens all the time, and all of a sudden, and you'll also be doing levels changes, and nothing changes.
Yeah, I was trying to move it, and I'm like, but it's not really doing anything.
Yeah, that's why. Okay, so I feel like this was a pretty good start for things. I am going to do a little bit of cleanup now, so I'm going to move in. I know I've got those beads that are sitting right in the middle of her chest that need to be fixed. So that's the thing I'm going to go after first. I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush. Make sure that your brush is a completely hard brush so that you don't worry about overspraying out into any area outside that could have gone to all this trouble to actually make this edge. Hit the D key to default your colors to black and white, the X key to get black as my foreground color, and simply take care of that part. I'm going to look up in here. Sometimes you will actually pick up the catch lights in somebody's eyes. Those are also something to look for. I don't think I'm getting those in her, so I'm just going to continue to, there's another little dot right there of something. So I'm running down the sides just to check to make sure everything's fine down here. I just run my brush over there. I'm not actually painting on this because, again, I'm in a normal brush mode, but I can see that I do have tone that's actually still happening down there, and I've got a little tone that's still happening in here that I'm going to have to take care of. But I'm looking at the rest of this. That's all looking pretty good. I've got the floor I've got to deal with. I've got her shoes that I've got to deal with. I'm just going to run up the other side really quick. There's something right here on the side edge of her that is actually contamination. So I'm going to take care of those guys. Check out that hand. That guy's good. The rest of this actually looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to zoom back out. I'm going to change my brush from a normal brush to an overlay brush. I'm going to hit the X key to make sure that white is my foreground color. I am going to not keep this as a completely hard brush. I'm actually going to take it to like around the 60–70% in there, whatever. I want to soften that edge up just a little bit. I'm going to make my brush larger. And then right now, I am hovering over this area, and I can see that I'm getting a readout in the 250s, 250s. When I get up here closer to the top of her, I'm getting the same sort of thing. So I can tell pretty much all of this area around her is still got a little bit of tone in it. So I am going to simply use this brush to go all the way around her body. I'm not going to hit any of this hair. Again, I've got a relatively soft edge brush here, so I'm not going to worry about whatever spill comes into this. I can fix that later if it needs to be. But I'm just going to start in this area up in here, and I'm just gliding down the side down here. As you start to get areas that are closer to the edge of her dress, you can be a little bit more aggressive in terms of how close you're actually getting there. However, when I come down to the fur, I'm going to probably come in and be a little bit more aggressive about that guy as well and kick around. And you can really see the contamination coming out here now. And I get to the floor, and I'm just outlining the girl right now. I just came across the floor, and I've still got a bit of a shadow that's right here on this guy. I don't like this brush forcing me, in order for me to get this, my brush is forcing me to be painting on this fur quite a bit, and I don't need to be doing that. So in order to get my brush where I need it to be, I'm going to hit the F key to get to the paste board so that I can move this up and then only use the edge of my brush to repeatedly get rid of that little shadow. And also there's one in the very front of her right there. So then I'm going to continue. I'm having to do multiple strokes of this to go ahead and clean this out. That's actually okay. But again, don't be any more aggressive about this than you need to be. And be careful on this area over here. Okay, so look, I need to really look at my screen really quick. There's an area of her shoe right here that's actually pretty light, and there's another one right over here. I'm worried that these, if I use, well, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to hit this with white right now, and I think you'll see it starts to actually lighten that part up. I don't want that to happen. Command Z to undo that. I'm going to make for a much, much smaller brush. I'm going to hit the X key to go to black first, and I'm going to make that area and this area black before I run my white brush across it. And then, again, back to a much larger brush. X key to go back to white, and now when I go over that area, I don't take that chunk of shoe out, and the rest of that's pretty good. And then again, I'm just working my way up the side of her body like this. I'm going to zoom out a little bit to make this faster. And again, I'm still hovering. And again, up in this area, you don't need to do any changes because I'm getting 255 readouts. And I'm getting 255 readouts on this side as well. So I'm not right now, I'm just hovering over here. I'm not actually doing a brush stroke on this at all. And the area that goes on the top of her head, right over the very top of her head, there's a little bit. Finally, you need to check the area that's right down in here. That's sort of in this area down in here. And that does have contamination in it. So I'm actually going to go down and clean that out. And then the area between her legs has also got a small amount in it. So I'm going to just run this guy up and take care of that. I don't like the idea that it just took away that little bit of fur guy right there. So I'm just going to hit it like that and try and stay away. I'm going to double click on the hand to kick back out right now. And basically what I've done is I've built an outline that's around this girl. I've actually painted around her. So now what I'm going to do, again, go to a brush, make it a larger brush. Instead of overlay, I'm going to go to a normal brush. And then finally, I'm going to make it a completely hard brush. And in this case now, I'm simply going to try to stay away from this, but to connect and to clean up the rest of the area that's around it. I've already got a nice highlight that's all the way around her. And then once I get a good line that's all the way around her like that, I'm going to hit the L key to get a lasso tool. I'm going to drag my lasso tool relatively close to her body. I am going to feather this selection. Sometimes when you do this, if you immediately send the outside to white, you will actually be able to spot this line. So I am going to feather this selection slightly up to the modify menu, down to feather, and I'm going to put like a 5-pixel feather radius on it and say okay to that. I am going to then invert my selection. So I'm not inverting the image, but inverting the selection up to the select menu down to inverse. And now you'll see that you got the marching ants all the way around the rest of the image, and then hold down the option key and hit delete to fill that with white. Command D to deselect, and you should have a reasonably good knockout. At this point, I'm going to save my image. So up to save as. You guys, again, if you didn't do if you're late on this homework, this is your perfect opportunity to get it in. And I'm just going to put this in my toss folder. You can save yours to your desktop. This is not going to be turned in for homework if you've already turned it in, if it's already been graded. Okay, so I've got my knockout done. I'm going to see how good I did. I'm going to make a copy of my background layer. I'm going to then click on the first of the background layers so that I can put a white layer in between the two. So again, I'm going to click on a blank layer to put in between these two. I'm going to hit the D key to, again, default my foreground and background colors to black and white. Since white is my background color, I'm holding down Command and hitting Delete. That fills that layer with white. Finally, I'm going to come over and Command click to load my knockout as a selection. I'm going to come back to my background copy on the top and then add that as a layer mask. And then finally, because I do this backwards all the time, I'm going to invert the layer mask. And then immediately I'm going to zoom in here and inspect the hair and see how well that part actually did. And again, I do have spill in here, but I actually managed to keep a huge amount of the authenticity of it. As I look down here, I've got spill that's happening down in the fur as well. But as I zoom into her hand right here, I also see that dreaded contrast line that I've actually got here. So I need to be able to take care of all of these elements, which is where we're going to go next. So the thing I'm going to do first is to get rid of the spill. So I am going to pick my, I take that back. I'm not going to get rid of the spill first. Why don't we, because there's no point in, if we're going to be choking this image, there's no point in actually trying to work on spill that we're then going to choke out. So for instance, if I'm going to get rid of this area that's right around her hand, that line right there, no reason to remove the spill if I'm going to choke that in anyway. So I'm going to zoom into this hand, because I think this is a good example of a place to actually apply a choke and for us to see what's really going on. So before we apply a choke, I'm going to come over to the history palette. I'm going to click on the history snapshot, the little camera at the bottom. When you guys do that, do you get the new snapshot dialog box? Okay, perfect. I'm going to call this pre-choke. And say OK. And then with my mask active and selected, I'm going to come up to the filter menu down to blur, and I'm going to do a Gaussian blur on this guy. And this just put a 2 Gaussian blur on this, which looks possibly like enough. I'm not sure. I'm going to see what a 3 is. Again, guys, there's no magic number in doing this. You've just got to try it. That's all I can pretty much say. So I'm going to try a 3 and see. This 3 may be a little bit too much of a blur, but I'll show you how I would fix it, and then we'll go from there. So again, I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. And if I, again, hold down the Option key and click on my mask, you can see what I just did was I introduced, oh, look at this, look at this. In looking at my layer mask, I have just spotted all this contamination right in here on this part of the girl right here. So this gets to be an interesting trick to try to deal with. Do you guys, when you look at between her arm and that, do you see contamination like I'm seeing on mine? And actually, I'm getting it over here on this other area over here as well. This guy over here. I did not hit that curve hard enough to get rid of this contamination. So instead of trying to do this with an overlay brush, because I'm worried, you watch what happens with my overlay brush. I'm going to hit a B key to get an overlay brush. I'm going to make it a little bit narrower like this. I am going to go back to overlay. Hit the X key to actually have black in here. When I paint along that, you can see it sharpens everything up too much. Look what it just did to that arm. And it also kills an enormous amount of the feathery part of this guy right here. So that is, in my opinion, not a good idea. So I'm going to Command Z to undo that. Instead, I'm going to run levels on this guy again. All right, that's what this guy's actually looking at here. I'm going to go ahead and throw down one more color sampler point. So again, over to the color sampler tool, and I'm going to pick this area right in there because that seemed to be the lightest of them. Click and hold down the drop down to get an RGB readout, and Command L to bring up the levels dialog box and start to drag this guy over. And you can see it does a whole lot less damage than that overlay brush actually was doing, but it finally cleans the rest of that area out. Still keeps a relatively smooth part going on here. Look up at my screen. This is the difference in my preview, and it seems to be just cleaning that part out. Let me go check the hair before I say OK to all of this, just to make sure I'm not screwing that part up too bad. Yeah, it's cleaning up that area right around the hair. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. Now, in this case, I've just refined this mask. This mask is no longer the same thing as this guy right down here, this knockout right down here. So to take care of that, I am going to load this mask as a selection. Simply Command-click to load it. It is now loaded as a selection. I'm going to save it. I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to call it Select down to Save Selection. And I'm going to call this Knockout Revised 1. and say okay. Now, the pre-choke history state that we've made is no longer good for me because I have changed this mask. This state was made before I fixed this mask. So I am going to throw the pre-choke history state away, and I'm going to actually, wow, that took me all the way back. I'm still going to come down to here and make sure. It looks like it also removed my levels adjustment as well. Huh, that sucks. Let me go in and check just to make sure again. No, the curves actually, the levels adjustment actually is still there. Okay, so I'm still good to go, but that history state was no longer good. So now I can go back to where I should be with the rest of that stuff cleaned out. I am going to do now a new history state and call it pre-choke. And say okay to that. Zoom into the hand because that's where it's easiest to spot the problem. Right in here. Make sure that the layer mask is selected, up to the filter, down to blur. Lindsay, was that a hand up?
No, sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Gaussian blur, put a 3 blur on here and say okay to that. Command L to bring up the levels dialog box. Again, what we're doing is we are shifting those grays that we made, we're actually shifting them. But this is something that a lot of you guys ran into as well. As you start to pull the black in, it actually does start to, it's choking this thing, which is exactly what you want it to do. But it's also, this thing is actually really soft. It probably was too much of a Gaussian blur on here. So we could go back in time and redo that, or you can simply grab the white point slider and start to pull it back as well, because that is actually sharpening up the contrast on this edge. So again, I'm pushing this in and then using these two to actually control how sharp that edge is or not. Using your preview button to go on and off, you can actually see the correction that we're getting on the skin tone right here. And so I've almost got those two touching one another, which is a pretty fair indication that maybe that blur was a little too much. It maybe was better off to do it as a 2. So in that case, I'm not going to be too greedy about this. I'm going to cancel out of this. I'm going to go back one step in history, and I'm going to do another blur again, but this time I'm only going to use 2 pixels instead of 3, and try it again. Command L to bring up the levels dialog box. Do my choke. It still has got that edge still needs to be tightened up a little bit. Yeah, and it doesn't look like I did a whole lot better. It doesn't look like I've shifted a whole lot more as far as that part goes. But I feel like that's actually a reasonably good edge. Again, use your preview on and off to make sure that this looks correct. Before I say okay to that, I'm going to see just how much damage I'm doing to the dress. And that actually doesn't seem to be too bad. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. Immediately come over to your history palette, click and do another history state. Call it post choke. And say okay to that. And then in doing all of this work, we can go back 2 spaces in history. So before we have done any of the choking work in here, because remember, the choking was a combination of Gaussian blur and levels. So now I've gone back to undo that, which returns the unchoked areas. But I think it's easier to paint in the areas I want to be choked than to try to paint back the areas that I don't want to be choked. But it's kind of a 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. So I'm going to scroll to the top of my history palette. I'm going to check the little box next to post choke for my history state. I'm going to go to my history brush, and then coming over in this area right here, I'm actually going to run it down on this side of her hand. I'm going to leave it off the fur. I'm going to do the inside of her hand. I'm going to do around all of her fingers. I know I'm going to back off on this. I know I need to do the entire side of this dress. So maybe I should have. I got a whole lot more that has just got that little edge on it than I've got fuzzy hair, don't I? All right, so I'm going to go back to the beginning where I've done all of my history brush work to undo all of that. And I am going to actually go back. Let me see what's happening here. Yeah, so nothing has been choked on any of this right now. I'm going to confuse myself, so I'm staying right with where I'm going. I'm just going to run this along the edge of this girl's body. The dress and her skin tone, that's all I'm doing, is to go ahead and do that choke. You can actually make it a much larger brush so that this goes faster because it's only changing the edge. Stay away from the feathery boa at the bottom. Stay away from the feathery fur. All right, so good to go on that guy. Just kick back out, zoom out. Finally, it's ready. I'm ready to actually try to fix the spill that's actually happening in this guy. So again, I'm going to go onto my pixel layer to make sure it is active. Hit the B key to get a brush. Make sure that it is a completely soft brush. Change the blending mode to color. Sample the color of the boa right here by holding down the option key. And then again, I'm seeing a lot of people doing this. A lot of people are working from the inside out to this. That's changing color that does not need to be changed. You need to be working from the outside in so that the only thing you change is the stuff that has got green in it. So as we start to get into this little bit tighter quarters into here, make your brush just a little bit smaller so that you can actually get those little guys right in there and these little guys right over here. But again, do not be working from the outside in on that. That is a mistake. That part's actually done. I do have spill that's in the fur right here, so I'm going to sample the red. And again, working from the outside. And you'll see what I'm talking about. Look at that. Look at what that does. That is not what you want to have happen. So I'm going to resample lighter color down here. And as I start to get down here to my shadow, there is still some shadow underneath all of this. That's actually shadow that should be taken out. So I am going to go after that. With an overlay brush, back to my background mask right here. Hit the B key, go to an overlay brush. Again, this part of my mask needs to be black, so black is my foreground color. It's just this little shadow area that's happening underneath here. So I need to refine this mask again. So again, I'm simply hitting along there again. I'm going to hit it again and again. Wow, that guy does not want to go away. And then again, because I've just changed my mask yet again, let me finish refining this bottom edge down here. And it doesn't look like my overlay brush is going to ever get the rest of this. So I'm going to be even more aggressive about it. I'm going to go to a normal brush, make sure that it is a completely hard brush. And I'm going to nip away at this guy right down here, at these guys right here, to get rid of those little touches. And this guy as well. go back to an overlay brush to hopefully fix this last part. I can't get all of it. That part's still there. So again, back to a normal brush. Make it a little bit smaller and nip away at that. You could probably do this with a pen tool. All right, yet again, I have changed this mask. Command click to load the mask. Up to the select menu, down to save selection. Knockout revise 2. You can end up having 10, 15 of these revised if you start picking up problems like this. So again, back to my pixel mask to go after the spill that's in here, because that's the last part. Changing my brush back to color. Sample a color point that's actually down here. Make sure it's a soft brush. A little bit larger. I'm going to resample color up here. Resample here. Resample here. Resample here. So we all get how this is going, right? Okay. So for the most part, this part's actually working pretty well for me. I'm not going to finish this up. I do want to go ahead and clean up her hair really quick. But then, importantly, we are going to put this girl back on the ground again. So double click on the hand to get to the hair really fast. Zoom into her hair and this area up in here. So a lot of people, this was happening to a lot of people in this. When they sampled this girl's hair right in here, they actually picked up a lot of green. So again, I'm working on the pixel layer right here, holding down the Option key to sample a hair color. Make sure that it is color is your blending mode. And again, soft brush. And I'm going to sample this part right here, make it a little bit larger brush, and bring it up here to pull this color out. I'm going to, you see that she's got a lot of different colors in her hair. So I'm going to pick a completely different sample of color hair to go here more into the middle. And I'm going to pick another sample right here. Once I get this close to her face, I've got to go to a hard edge brush. Otherwise, I'm going to hit her ear, which I don't want to do, or the side of her face. I also don't want to do that. But you'll see now in my, for me, I think I'm pulling too much green back into this area right in here. So, and you can sort of see it on the screen right here. There's a little bit of red up here on the top. There's a little bit of green down in here. If you want to bring some of this red down in here, but you don't want to, I mean, you don't want to just keep going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. It's, oh, it's too red, it's too green, it's too red, it's too green. Instead, what you can do is you can sample this redder area that's up in here and then simply drop the opacity of your brush down to like a 50% to only mix in a little bit of that red so that you can actually sort of custom make your own hair color. I'm going to come up here again to this area up in here, but I am going to go back up to 100% to take care of that. Again, constantly resampling on here, because as I start to go over and get into shadow on this side of her face, her hair actually changes color. And you can see I've sampled green in here that I need to get rid of. So I've got to sample an area out here that's got less green in it to start to pull that green in. But again, I think that's too strong. I think that that looks too obvious. So Command Z to undo that. I'm going to drop my opacity down again to like 50% to bring in a little bit of red to combat that green, but not completely change that hair color. That seems far more believable to me. Back out to one of these lighter tones, back up to 100% opacity in that to go ahead and get these areas that are a little bit more in the front. Possibly, oops, I just used a soft brush and went right over the top of her ear, and you could see where that happened. So again, back to a completely hard brush. Actually get this area that's next to her skin and down into here. Much smaller brush to get this area right by her neck. Then the part of her bow up fur thing up here at the top, is pretty neutral. I really hope that isn't as loud as that sounded on the video. Sorry, guys. Actually, there's not as much. I just hit this out here. Way too much gray in that. Command Z to undo that. This should actually have some more of this sort of like brownish tone out in here like that. Yeah, that's much better. And the same thing on the other side. Again, up into here, where you sort of are like combining hair and fur. Pick one. It's not going to be ultimately wrong. There's another little bit of spill right around her ear. That's actually her skin tone. So I'm actually going to pick her skin tone to get rid of that guy. Still got a little bit right there. I've got a small amount of green glow right here on the side of her cheek. So again, I'm coming from, come on, undo. From the outside in, I think that stripped too much of that color out. Command Z to undo that. Again, drop your opacity slider down to 40, 50% so that you're not completely sucking all that color out. All right, I feel pretty good about this guy. I'm going to go ahead and save this image again. I've already saved it once, so I just need to hit save again. And then finally, we are going to build shadows for this girl. So is everybody feeling relatively good about where we're at right now? Are we okay on this? Okay, so when we were talking about shadows last week, I said to you guys that we could do, there's a number of ways of doing shadows. There is the simplest form, which is what I showed you guys last week, and that's basically just painting the shadows. That would be the way to actually do it. We're going to do two versions of shadows this week. We're going to do the incredibly complex version of shadows, but we're going to do the sort of medium version of shadows and the way to do those, and that's what we're going to actually do right now. So I'm going to create a sort of an artificial surface for her to be on, sort of an indication of a floor. To do that, I'm simply going to double-click on the hand to zoom all the way back out. I am then going to, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I am going to come down to my layer one, guy right here. I'm going to add an empty layer on top of that, a blank layer on top of that, because I want this to be behind the girl. I am going to grab the marquee tool, the rectangular marquee tool, and I'm going to select everything down to about the middle of her shins is sort of where I'm going to go. Yeah, I think that actually will be good right there. Maybe down just a little bit more. Something like that. That's going to be where I'm actually going to put her. That's going to be a wall that's actually behind her now. I'm going to pick a color that we can actually put, make that wall behind her. And the color I think I'm going to sample is going to be a color of one of those beads. So I've picked it sort of like an olivish brown, something like that. We'll see what it looks like. And just fill the space back behind her. Oh, that doesn't look very good, does it? Oh, no. So what color are we going to make this back there behind her, guys?
White.
White. Well, then it's a white on a white floor. Okay, wait. Okay. Hang on. Let's do that. Let's do this. We'll just make it. Say what? Oh. Oh, yeah, sure, color does look pretty good. All right. I'm going to go with a much, let's just do this. If you want to do the same as mine, it's not going to matter. It's not going to matter. If you want to do the same as mine, click the foreground color, and for your red value, put in a 245. Hit the tab key. For green, put 245. And the same thing for the blue. Make this a sort of a pretty lightish gray. See if we can get any sort of like tone behind her. 245. It doesn't really put any tone behind her, so let's try this. Let's do 230. 230. And say okay to that. And then again, fill that with that. Yeah, that works. You get a little bit. So I've sort of got a floor. It could be a white wall. It's just, there's a little bit of light behind her. I just wanted to make some distinction between wall and floor just to give us the illusion. If you really want this illusion to be a little bit more believable, go ahead and merge this new color down into your white layer. To do that, you hold down the Command key and hit the letter E, and it merges we had that top, here, I'll show you, look at my screen really quick. I've got this top layer is selected. When you hit Command E, it simply merges it down to the layer right below it. So again, Command E, and you'll see it goes down to the layer below it. And the reason I'm doing that is I've got to blur this line right here. I've got to blur where these two things meet, because if this was a real photograph, this would be much further behind her, and the depth of field would not allow this to be as light as it is, as sharp as it is right here. And so then you can just blur that area as well. So up to the filter menu, down to blur, down to Gaussian blur, and I've got a 2-pixel blur on there right now. I'm going to turn this on and off. I'm going to hit that up a little bit harder. And I'm going to keep hitting that a little harder. So I'm up to like a 5 on mine. Yeah, and that seems to be a little bit better. 4.5, 5, somewhere in there. That part actually seems to work. And then finally, guys, just so that you know, this is a synthetic background that we've created in Photoshop. This is not going to print out as being real at all. If you do want your backgrounds, you can use synthetic backgrounds. You can create them. But to give them a little bit more reality, you need to add some noise to them. So to do that, again, make sure that you've got this background layer is active. Up to the filter menu, down to noise, down to add noise. And the noise that comes up, depending on what it is we're actually doing here, can be a number of things. There is an amount slider here, and you can see as you crank the amount slider up, you get you really aggravate, you really can see the amount of noise that you're actually getting into this. There's 2 ways that noise is actually generated, and it's just 2 versions. One is more random than the other. This uniform radio dialog box makes it pretty much the same all over. If you hit Gaussian in this, it runs a different algorithm on it that actually randomizes this more. Personally, I think it's more successful when you randomize it using the Gaussian algorithm. And then also you can click on monochromatic, which removes all the color from this. However, up at 143%, this is far too aggressive. So I'm going to crank this all the way back down to about where it started from in here. And again, you can use your preview box to come in and check on this. You can zoom in a little bit on this. I'd say that 11% is still too aggressive. So I'm simply hitting it down and taking a look at it. It's 7%. It's still too aggressive. So again, I'm going to actually type in a value. So I'm going to put in a 5% on this. Again, use your preview button on and off. And you can see that it puts something in there, keeping this from being a synthetic background. And so that's what I'm going to do. I did monochromatic Gaussian at about 5%. Okay, so the final thing that we've got going on here is we actually need to give this girl shadows. So again, I'm working on the pasteboard, which allows me to hold down the space bar and move my image around using the hand, which is what I want to do. So the next set of shadows that we're going to build a set of shadows now. To do this, I want you to add an empty group, and where the shadows go is they go on top of your background, but underneath your figure. So with the background layer active, click on the group to add a layer group on top of this. I'm going to double click that group name, and I am going to call it shadows. It's a good thing I do not have to rely on my typing skills, SHADOW, for a living. Okay, with that, guys, selected, we are going to click on a blank layer. The trick to doing these kind of shadows is that you want to build this up slowly using quite a few layers. That's actually the best way to ultimately do this, so that we really have controls. Shadows are very complex things. They're not just, suffice to say they're complex. So I'm going to show you the way, again, sort of the medium easy way of doing this part right now. So to get to this, the first thing we need to do is actually find a shadow color. So I'm going to zoom in to this area that is right underneath her fur, right under here. There's an area right down in here, it looks like, that actually is shadow. There's another one that's right under here. These are true shadows, because the thing is that shadows rarely are a pure black. Usually they have some color cast to them. So I'm going to pick on the foreground color picker, and I'm going to click into this shadow here really quick right here. And you can see, although it is extremely dark, it actually here is got a little bit more red and green than it actually has blue. That would be one possible place to pick. Another possible place to pick would actually be the shadow of the where the strap is being cast on her foot right here. I'm going to click into that area and see what that guy looks like. This has actually got a little bit more green in it now than it does in the other colors, whatever. So if you can find a place that actually does have a good shadow in it, or a real shadow that actually might be worth going after or looking for, in this case, I don't see the best of all possible places. Usually shadows have a little bit of blue in them. If you really wanted to change this and to amp up the blue a little bit, you could certainly do that. You could just simply click on your blue radio button right here and change that value up to like a 10. And again, that would simply put a little bit more blue into this color than we would normally have. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. So it's just something that's not a pure black. The next thing I'm going to do is go to the gradient tool to get to the, yes, Lindsay.
What were the numbers?
I ended up with 3 red, a 5 green, and a 10 blue. Okay. So with this first layer selected, and this guy right here, you want to come up to the gradient tool. It's this guy right here. It's the gradient tool. It falls up above the dodge and burn tool and below the eraser tool. So it's the gradient tool right here. When you use the gradient tool, there's a series of different gradients that we have. Last week when we were trying to do one of our gradients, we actually used the reflected gradient. It was this one right here. To see what gradients actually look like, let's select the very first one, the first of the gradient icons right over here. If you also click on this drop-down menu, what I want you to do is select the very first gradient. What the very first gradient is always foreground color to background color. What the next gradient is foreground color to transparency. What the next one is black to white. And then there's a whole series of predetermined gradients in here. You can add more gradients to this. If you click on this little drop-down wheel, you will actually see that you can add color harmonies, you can add metals, neutral densities, pastels, photographic tonings. There's all sorts of gradients that you can do. You can actually build your own gradients. Just like the swatches panel, you can have a drop-down menu to get larger or smaller versions of this. All of this actually exists all in right here. You can delete them, you can add new ones, you can do the whole 9 yards. But in our case, we're satisfied with this part right here. We're going to start with this very first gradient right here with, again, the foreground to background color and the first of the shapes of gradients. I'm going to zoom back out. And to see what the first of the shapes of the gradients actually does, if you simply click on one side and drag to the other side and let go, it will put, let's go ahead and turn our figure off just so that we don't see it right here. It just puts a gradient across your image. If you click in the middle and only go a very short distance, it will do the darkest of your gradient on one side. The area that you drew will be the transition, and then all of the area to the other side will actually be the top end. So this is all black. This is all white. The only gradient that I actually got was that small little amount of line that I actually picked there. If you want a gradient that goes from one side all the way to the other, you need to draw it all the way from one side to the other. So you click and you come all the way over to this other side and then let go, and that will give you a gradient that runs all the way across. If you click and drag at a diagonal, your gradient will go in the direction of the diagonal. If you click and hold and you come across and you hold down the Shift key, it will restrict your movement to either being perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical. In this case, it would be perfectly horizontal. It kicks across that way as well. If you come up, do you guys have these grid lines on your image right now? Yep. To get rid of those grid lines, come up to the View menu and come down and do Clear Guides. Then we are going to bring in 2 new guides. To get to our guides, again, because you're on the pasteboard, You will never actually see it on the other side. So we need to get away from the pasteboard for just a second. Hit the F key once, you go to the black pasteboard. The F key again, you go to the normal pasteboard. And in this case, you'll, on your ruler on the side, click your ruler and bring it over, and it should snap onto the edge of your image. If it doesn't, when you come off like that, it's because you're using your tablet. Don't use your tablet. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. Use your mouse. When this comes over and it gets close to it, it will snap onto the edge of your image and you can let go. That has now got a grid line that's perfectly on that edge of the image. You can do the exact same thing to the one that's on the other side. It will snap to it. And the reason you want to do that is that now when you go back to your gradient tool, you can actually, when you click, that gradient tool will start on that grid line. It will also snap to that grid line, which means you are perfectly aligned or perfectly on that edge of your image. So click on that, come over to the other side, hold down the Shift key to get it to restrict. And then again, when you get close to the other side, it will snap to the other guideline. And now when you let go, that is a perfect gradient from right to left. I'm going to hit the F key to go back to the pasteboard again. I am going to get rid of those guidelines again because I don't need them. I just wanted to show you guys, whenever you do need to get a perfect gradient, that's the only way you can actually do it. You'll never be able to do it any other way. Again, up to the view menu, down to clear guides to get rid of those guides. So that's one kind of gradient, linear gradient. The next one that we come over is what is called a radial gradient. So again, I went up to the very top up here, clicked on the second icon across it, and now when you click and drag out, you get a circular gradient. Looks like that. The further that you click and drag out, the further out, the larger that your gradient actually is. The next one is you click over. The next one is actually supposed to be, what it's supposed to give you is the illusion of perspective. So this is actually supposed to be a cone shape that's coming out at you. And then finally, the next one that goes over is the reflected gradient. Again, I'm going to do one top to bottom. And in this one, you'll actually get, again, lightness at the top to your gradient in the middle and then back out again. So you get sort of a double effect. If you drag a long way out, you'll actually see what's happening there. And then finally, the last one is actually also, the last one actually is this, the inverse of a cone, I guess. It's supposed to be, imagine you're standing inside a church and you're looking up at the steeple. That's supposed to be the illusion that you're getting here. But the gradient that we want to use is this radial gradient right here. So I want you to go ahead and pick the radial gradient, click and drag, and you will actually see that it starts in the middle and it goes out to, it starts at black in the middle and then it feathers out. However, the gradient that I want to actually use is not this foreground to background color. To build shadows, you want to use foreground to transparency. To do that, click on the drop-down gradient right here and change to the second one in. So you can see that this is going from black to the checkerboard. And what that is an indication is that it's going from foreground color, which is black, or in our case, it's not that pure black. It's that 3 red, 5 green, 10 blue. That's the color we're doing this with. That's going to be the color here, going to transparency. And now when you click and drag, what you'll see is, what you should see is, oh, this is actually on a white one. So throw this whole layer away for me really quick. We need to start with a blank layer. We need to start with a transparent layer. Because now what you'll see is if you click and you drag out, this actually goes, it remains transparent on your layer. So does that make sense what's going on here? We all good on this? Okay, I'm going to turn my figure back on so that I can actually see it. But I have this gradient now that is actually on, it's back behind this girl. If you hit the V key, you can actually move this guy around, and you can see that's what I was talking about, is it's actually going to transparent. However, what I want to do for ours is I want to transform this guy. Hit Command T, that will actually transform this. If you then hold down the Option key, if you don't hold down the Option key and you simply click on one of these handles, it crushes it like in this direction. However, if you hold down the Option key, it compresses it from both sides, which is what we want to do. So I'm compressing this guy from both sides, And then I'm going to do the same thing from right to left. I'm actually going to come in to drag in to make this guy much, much, much smaller like this. So I've actually just crushed this gradient down to sort of look like this. If the handles get in your way and you don't like the way the handles look, you can hit Command H and they're hidden. They're still there. You can actually see if you hover over this and click and drag, you can still transform this guy. The same thing is you can still push in this way, but it's at least at this way, I don't see the handles, which actually helps me out a lot. If you put your cursor right in the middle of this guy, you will see that you can actually move it. It's go ahead and hit the transform. Go ahead and hit OK to that. Hit the V key to get the move tool. And what I'm going to try to do is move this thing right underneath this girl's foot right down here. I'm going to zoom in underneath this foot right here. And again, there's a number of things that we can still do with this that we can actually change on this. So I could, for instance, hit Command T again. I think that this shadow is a little too wide. So I'm actually going to narrow this thing down and move it so that it's in a little bit better place, and hit the Enter key. And that is the beginning of the shadow that I'm actually putting down here as far as this part goes. However, I think this is probably too strong a shadow, so I'm going to drop the opacity of this guy back, and I'm going to get it back to like, I've got it about a 50%. I am then going to hit a brand new layer on top of this and do the exact same thing again. The command keyboard shortcut for the gradient tool is the G key. If you simply hit the G key again and drag out another gradient, Command T to transform it, hold down the Option key to compress this so that it again is actually doing both things in both directions. I'm actually going to make this guy a little bit smaller and a little bit flatter now. And then finally, I'm going to move it under this area that's sitting right underneath her foot right here. I've taken it a little bit too. I'm going to actually broaden it out just a little bit more. And hit the Enter key again to actually go ahead and commit that transform. New layer. G key for gradient tool. Drag it out. Command T. Hold down the Option key. This just keeps going on and on and on and on like this to try to build up a believable density in the shadow that's actually underneath this girl's foot. I'm only working on one foot right now. You might be able to. Again, because their feet, if they're somewhat similar in shape, you might be able to. We'll see. Because I actually think that this foot, do you feel like that toe is touching the ground, or is that foot lifted? It's what? If it's lifted, then that's going to be a different issue right here. So again, I'm going to go ahead and hit Command T to put this part in. But you see where this whole process is actually going. You can go back and rework these shadows. So for instance, if you turn off the very first one that we put down, if you feel like that guy isn't quite shaped right, just go ahead and select it again. Make the layer active again. Command T to come up. I think it's a little bit broad in my case, so I'm going to narrow this down just a little bit more like that, and go ahead and hit Command T like that. Now you can see that the shadow that we're actually building here, it starts to be a very complex thing, and it starts to be believable. If you feel like that you need to clean this up, that it's really good underneath it, but let's say it's shooting too far out. As a matter of fact, I'm going to just make it, I'm going to crank the opacity up so that you can actually see this area. If you feel like this area is too strong, this is what I want you to do. We are going to now employ flow for the first time in this class. If you hit the eraser tool and come up, the mode that you want to use for this is brush. But you want to take your flow on this and crank it down to like a 10%. So keep dragging this guy down. And what you'll see happens is this, or type in 10% for your flow. This is what's going to happen. I'm going to make my brush a little bit larger so that you can actually see it. And working again on this big shadow that's actually kicking out on the side of her feet right here. if I was at 100% flow, I would simply erase that whole shadow. But with flow down like this, I can simply start working across the, hang on one second. I need to check and make sure that that's a completely soft brush. It was a completely hard brush. Flow down at 10%. The brush mode is, the mode is, so this is brush. And then again, come in here now and start working across this. And you can continue to move across it, and it doesn't like wipe things out completely. It lets you actually go back in and really sort of control sort of what's happening there. Does that make sense? If it's too fast for you, then you need to drop your flow even further down. So again, crank it down to like a 5%. And then as you push just back and forth, it will slowly fade that stuff back out. Make sense? Okay, so I am going to duplicate the shadows here. We'll see if this part actually works. I'm simply going to collapse them first right here. I'm going to rename this guy, though, Shadows 1. And I am going to simply drag the whole group down and duplicate it and hit the V key to get the move tool and drag this guy over to the other side. And this is what I meant by whether that foot is up or not. If that foot is actually up, it cannot be the same shadow. It won't fall in the same place. It would actually fall forward slightly more than the other one would be. And then I'm going to open this guy up because there would also be light that would actually be being let in. So I've got to get rid of, maybe I don't have to get rid of, but I need to reduce the opacity of some of the darker ones that are underneath. So I've got my top layer selected. I'm going to start really cranking that opacity down. The middle layer, I'm going to start pulling that opacity down. And my bottom layer, pull that opacity down. Yeah, because this would not be anywhere near as dark as the one where her foot's actually on the ground. Double click the hand and take a look back out here, and you can actually see that this is beginning to work pretty well. Now, overall, I think these shadows are completely too dark, so you can simply grab the group itself and lower the opacity of everybody that's within the group. It's just it drops everybody in the exact same fashion. So pull that part back, not quite that much. And you're starting to build shadows. Are there questions about this? Simply drag the group. It works just like duplicating a layer. So if you simply drag the entire group down to the little dog ear guy, it makes another copy of it. You can do an amazingly good job doing this, guys. My screen image up here looks much, my screen image on my computer looks a whole lot better than the screen image going on up here. But that's the trick to doing it. There would be an overall shadow for the girl herself, completely, again, that would actually be going on. And actually looking at the girl, one of the things that we didn't do is you can see that this actually is a side light for this girl. So the truth be told, all of these shadows actually need to stretch, because right now I've got them perfectly centered under her foot. All of these shadows actually need to kick further out to the side. So again, I'm going to start on this group right here. I'm going to Command T this guy and simply drag this edge out a little bit further. And I'm going to go to this guy, the one that's right underneath it. And again, Command T him and drag that side out a little bit further as well. And finally go down to the last one. And Command T this guy and drag that guy a little further out as well. Possibly push this guy in a little bit. Yeah. And now the shadow isn't, the shadow is actually offsetting to the side, which is more in what would be happening with the side of her body. This part of the shadow right here on this foot would not exist because the light is coming from this direction. This shadow was built as if the light was coming straight down. It's not. So we need to fix this edge of it here as well. So again, I'm going to come down to my Shadows 1, and I'm going to start at the very bottom. And I am going to grab the eraser tool. And I'm going to completely get rid of that edge right there. Go to my next layer and get rid of that edge right there. And my next layer and get rid of that edge right there. Because that's more how that would actually happen. And again, probably push the opacity of this guy back up a little bit. Yeah. And again, I would probably have to stretch those out as well, just a little bit more. So there you go, guys. Easy way to do shadow. Oh, not easy. Well, it's, in my opinion, this takes longer than painting, but how did you guys who were doing the painting, how did that work for you? Not super? Does this seem like maybe a better option? Yeah.
So why did you put the other shadow in front of her toes as the foot is up?
So what?
Why are the shadows on this foot in front?
Because you have to have space between the two. If her foot was actually touching the ground like that, then the shadow would be right under it. But with her foot up, you see underneath her foot.
Okay, so her foot's up.
Her foot is not touching the ground, so the shadow can't touch her foot. Yeah, so going back, is her foot on the ground in the real image?
Yes.
Okay, so her foot's on the ground in the real image, so we'll just fix it here. Aaron just looked at the original knockout and said that this foot was actually there, so simply go to Shadows 2. And again, we can move the entire group, the V key, real simply, and take this back. And again, in this case, it would be much more similar to this one over here. So we'll crank the opacity on it back up again. And again, I would probably clean up a little bit. I think this edge shadow needs to kick over a little bit more, and this one we need to lose a little bit on this side, but you sort of get where this is all going, right? And then finally, although not finally, it's just something that, again, these things take forever. You would have to do similar work for some of the fur as well. There should be shadow that actually happens underneath here. We would do it in the same way. But finally, there is an overall shadow for the girl herself that's actually considerably larger. So again, I've got two shadow groups right here. I'm going to go ahead and do one more group. We'll call that Shadows 3. And inside Shadows 3, I'm going to put a blank layer. Hit the G key to get the gradient tool and pull out rather large gradient. Here again, hit the V key to move it, bring it over here so it's more like in this space. And you can see what happened is my gradient went all the way over and hit that edge, and that actually caused it to have this hard line. That is not going to work for me, so I'm going to throw that guy away and put in a blank, another new layer, and do the gradient more in the middle of her so that I don't get that hard edge. So what? I'm still using the what? Yeah, still using the circle guy. Command T to bring up the gradient dial, the transform dialog box. Hold down the Option key. Click and shift on this to compress this guy down. It actually is going to stay larger now. It's not going to be quite as because I'm doing the sort of the bigger, broader shadow for her completely. So again, the width on this seems to me to be about right. I'm going to drop this down and compress that slightly and move that a little bit more under her. Go ahead and hit the enter key to actually do that, and then drop the opacity of this guy way back. It's hard to see. What I would think is that you wouldn't have. It's conceivable that part of her body could be throwing shadow down here, but not a lot. So I think what I would do is move the entire thing. I'm moving the whole shadow in this direction. And that actually seems to be more, for me, more believable. Again, I've still got a little bit of shadow that's on this side that really probably shouldn't be there. And I've pushed this thing over quite a bit to begin with. So again, I'm going to go back to my eraser tool, make it a little bit larger, still with that small flow on here. And again, continue to work back and forth to try to get rid of that part right there. And so then this is what we've got going on. So in our image now, from where we're at, if we take a snapshot of what the image looks right now, snapshot dialog box comes up. I'm going to say with shadows. And say, okay, I'm going to turn off all of my shadows and do another snapshot and call it without shadows. And say, okay. And then it's just an easier way using history states to turn on multiple layers on and off, because otherwise it's way too hard to do it. So you can simply click on with the shadow and click on without and click on with. And I don't know about you guys, but that just put that girl right in space. And again, if you feel like it's too strong on our shadow number 3, you can continue to drop the opacity down on that guy, down a little bit more. So it's a little bit more like that. Actually, that seems a little bit better. You could do yet another snapshot, call that with shadow 2, just to give you some way to go back and forth. So this is now with shadows, my first version of it. This is now my second version of it, which I think is more successful. And so that's how I would actually leave that. Okay, are there questions about this? All right, guys, I have got 20 till. Let's get back here at 5 minutes of 8, and we will jump into even more complex shadows than this. 5 minutes till 8.